Look at your phone on the nightstand. One alarm, set the night before. Tomorrow it drags you out of sleep at the exact minute you chose. You trust it completely. You never think about it twice. That trust is new. For nearly all of human history, waking up on time was not a setting. It was a genuine, constant problem. Get it wrong, and you could lose your wages or your job. No reliable machine for it either. Bells, candles, water. Eventually, other human beings, paid to wake you up on command. The story of how humanity solved waking up will change how you look at that small glowing screen tonight. Every layer of it is still hiding inside there. Start with the deeper question. Why did waking on time matter so little for so long, and then suddenly matter enormously? For thousands of years, most people woke with the sun, worked by daylight, stopped when it got dark. Time was loose, seasonal, mostly self-enforced. Some historians argue pre-industrial sleep worked differently entirely. Households in early modern Europe may have woken for an hour in the night, then returned to a second sleep before dawn. No single fixed waking moment at all. Precision timekeeping existed, but it belonged to institutions with a reason to need it. Temples, monasteries, later, factories. Ordinary daily life simply didn't require it. The earliest tools for tracking hours were built for daylight, not darkness. Egyptian obelisks and later sundials cast a moving shadow read against marked lines, splitting the day into hours long before anyone needed to wake in the dark. But a sundial is useless the moment the sun goes down. Exactly the problem that mattered most, waking before daylight, even began. So the earliest tools for tracking time without the sun ran on something that changed at a steady rate instead. The water clock. The clepsydra, attributed to the Babylonians and Egyptians roughly 3,500 years ago. Water dripped from one marked vessel into another. The changing level told the hour. Candle clocks worked the same idea, wax instead of water. A candle marked with evenly spaced lines, each one marking a passage of time as it burned down through the night. Some candle clocks doubled as genuine alarms. A metal nail or ball pressed into the wax at a chosen mark. When the flame burned down that far, the metal dropped onto a plate below. A loud, startling clatter, strikingly literal. To wake at a specific hour, you had to calculate exactly how much candle would burn between now and then. For most people, individual devices weren't the answer at all. Communities solved it collectively, through the church bell. Medieval religious life ran on a strict schedule of prayer hours. One monk, quite literally, woke before everyone else and rang the bell that woke the entire community. Getting that job right mattered so much that early mechanical escapements, the ticking heart of every clock that came after, were first built specifically to trigger a bell automatically, so no monk would oversleep the wake-up call again. Church bells set the rhythm for entire towns beyond the monastery walls too. The start of the working day, the midday pause, the close of business, whether or not you owned a clock of your own. For centuries, waking up on time mostly meant living within earshot of a bell tower and trusting someone else to ring it. Towns added a human layer on top of the bells. In many early modern European cities, a paid night watchman walked the streets through the dark hours, calling out the time and the weather at regular intervals. Some carried a bell or horn. Others simply shouted the hour aloud, block by block, so anyone lying awake always knew roughly how much night remained. Then, in the late 18th and 19th centuries, the problem changed shape entirely. Because of the factory, industrial employers didn't care what time the sun came up. They needed every worker at a specific machine at a specific minute. One late worker could stall the whole production line. Lateness now carried a direct financial penalty. Fined, docked pay, dismissed outright for missing a shift by only a few minutes. Farm labor never punished lateness that way. And a personal mechanical alarm clock was still expensive, often unreliable, well out of reach for the working class who needed one most. Waking up on time had gone, within roughly a single generation, from a loose personal habit to a hard economic requirement. Entire families, sometimes including children as young as 8 or 9 working in textile mills, now had to be moving through freezing streets in the same narrow window, whatever the season. Rural workers had relied on the rooster's crow for centuries before this, an alarm nobody had to wind or pay for. It worked poorly for shift workers whose start times had nothing to do with sunrise. Into that gap stepped one of the strangest jobs the industrial world ever created, the knocker-up. Across industrial Britain and Ireland, and parts of the Netherlands under a different name. Knocker-ups walked pre-dawn streets carrying a long pole, tapping on bedroom windows until they saw movement, then moving to the next house. Early knocker-ups sometimes used loud bells or noisemakers, but neighbors complained about being woken along with the client. So the trade quietly switched to quieter tools. Upper-floor windows demanded a longer reach. Some carried poles of light bamboo, 15 feet long, just to tap a second-story pane without waking the street. Others, like East London knocker-up Mary Smith, photographed in 1931, used a long rubber tube to fire dried peas at the glass instead, precise enough to hit one window and leave its neighbors undisturbed. The job paid only a few pence a client a week, done disproportionately by elderly men and women for whom very early hours suited an already broken sleep schedule. Almost comic today, but it was a real, structured, paid profession. In parts of industrial England, it survived, remarkably, into the 1970s. Here's the part nobody tells you. The mechanical alarm clock wasn't invented after the knocker-up. It came well before, and simply couldn't compete on price for another century. In 1787, American clockmaker Levi Hutchins built what's usually credited as the first mechanical alarm clock in Concord, New Hampshire, purely for himself. It could only ring at one fixed time, 4 in the morning, the hour he personally needed to wake. He never patented or sold the design. The first adjustable mechanical alarm waited another 60 years. In 1847, French clockmaker Antoine Redier patented a mechanism that let users set the alarm to any hour they liked. Even after that, alarm clocks stayed rare and costly for decades. Hand-built, small batches, well out of reach for a working-class household. The real shift came in the late 1870s. American manufacturers like Seth Thomas and the Ansonia Clock Company began true mass production. Stamped brass parts on assembly lines, not hand-fitted components. Seth Thomas reportedly went from around 100 alarm clocks a day in 1876 to roughly 1,000 a day within a year. By the early 1880s, a basic model sold for as little as $1.50. Only then, with a machine finally cheap enough for an ordinary worker's home, did the knocker-ups trade genuinely begin to fade. Decades after the technology that replaced it had already existed. Even so, the two systems overlapped for years rather than switching overnight. Seen that way, the whole story stops looking like a straight line of progress. It starts looking like a relay, each solution filling a gap the last one couldn't. Bells solved it for a community at the cost of forcing everyone onto the same schedule. Candle and water clocks solved it for one household at the cost of constant attention and recalculation. Knocker-ups solved it precisely for one paying individual without a single owned machine in the house. And the mass-produced mechanical clock finally solved it cheaply and privately, enough that a worker no longer needed a bell tower, a burning candle, or another human tapping at the glass. Each layer didn't replace the one before it overnight. It just took over once it became cheaper or more reliable for the people who needed it most. There's also a quieter thread running through all of it. For most of human history, waking up on time meant depending on somebody else. A monk rang a bell for his brothers. A knocker-up walked a freezing street at 4 in the morning so a stranger could keep their job. Waking was, for centuries, a small act of care performed by one person for another. Employers, meanwhile, weaponized the same clocks meant to help workers. Some were documented deliberately setting workplace clocks forward in the morning and back at night, manufacturing lateness to justify docking pay. The alarm clock, and later the mechanical time clock patented by Willard Bundy around 1890, stamped a worker's arrival on a paper card. It removed that human dependency almost entirely, made timekeeping something a single machine or a single employer could enforce alone. The clock in your pocket today has quietly absorbed every layer of that history at once. A smartphone alarm can ring like a bell, wake you as precisely as any mechanical spring ever could, can even nudge you gently awake through a snooze button. A small mercy no knocker-up or monk was ever able to offer a client who wanted 5 more minutes. So the next time your alarm goes off and you silence it without a second thought, remember what that single, ordinary sound replaced. The monk climbing a cold tower stairwell before dawn, the candle burning down toward a hidden nail, Mary Smith walking an East London street with a pea shooter and a list of addresses, doing by hand what your phone now does for free. A French patent, an American factory pressing stamped brass by the thousand. It took 3,500 years to make waking up on time something you never have to think about. Look at that small glowing screen tonight, one more time. Every layer of that history is still in there, quietly doing its job.
Ah, I understand. Follow, and see you next time. For another thing, you'll never look at the same way again.